Check, check.
All right, we are on the record. Have several issues to take care of this morning. First and foremost,
Gigi, what's going on? Good morning.
Motion for judgment of
Or
acquittal.
good
Mr. Nelson.
noon.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, pursuant to our discussions yesterday in terms of the timeliness of this motion, at this point the defense moves.
Oh yeah,
Minnesota rule.
this isn't live. This is the beginning. I'm gonna play all of it and skip the breaks. I guess I should remove the word live.
6.03, subdivision 18, paren 1, for a judgment of acquittal in this particular case. I'm sure that the court is very familiar with the legal standards applicable in this case. The court needs to view the evidence as presented in the light most favorable to the state. At this point, Your Honor, the defense submits that the state has failed to present sufficient evidence, even in the light most favorable to the state, to establish two of the principal issues or arguments in this particular case. The use of force and whether the use of force was reasonable, as well as the cause of death of Mr. Floyd. Starting first and foremost with the use of force, what the state has essentially done is provided 6 different opinions from various police officers or use of force experts, all of which seem to contradict themselves or each other. For example,
yeah, I missed all of it until like I was only watching it for like 20 minutes, so whatever. This is the defense's witnesses, so this is the fun part.
That Mr. Floyd ceased struggling. Mr. Zimmerman, or Lieutenant Zimmerman, has the opinion that even at the point of, that the force became unreasonable, use of force became unreasonable when Mr. Floyd was handcuffed. Chief Arredondo, I think, approached it from a different perspective because that was more of a civil employment standard, and it was a violation of MPD policy versus a real statement in terms of the use of force. Ultimately, the 2 experts that the state has presented.
How you doing, Gigi? Looking good, feeling good? You having a good day or what?
Are 2, they even disagreed with each other. So you have a myriad of inconsistent, complicated use of force opinions that really demonstrate the difficulty of establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that the use of force was objectively unreasonable, which is the standard under Graham versus Connor. Well, they all ultimately said it was objectively unreasonable at some point. The question is when
the pathologist they put on the stand first is so boring. He about put me to sleep. Shit.
On that. In addition, Your Honor,
if it's that bad, we'll skip him.
You again have, as the court is aware,
if I start to fall asleep, we'll skip him.
Has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. You have the testimony of Drs. Tobin, Dr. Rich, and Dr. Smock, who ultimately testified.
Dr. Spock?
And Dr. Lindsay Thomas. Those 4 doctors ultimately concluded that it was an asphyxial death. However, the state likewise presented Dr. Baker's testimony, which in large part, while he declared it a homicide for...
Yeah, you're good? Nice. Yes, I'm also good. I am also good.
Obligations, or the criminal standard.
And he's still on the stand?
Something much different, which was that Mr. Floyd's heart...
So this dude only called 1 witness in this whole...
of the circumstances.
2 hours?
So
or 3.5 hours? No fucking way.
Essentially introduced
oh no, there's one chick.
In the
someone else.
of providing
long break.
Opinions,
this guy.
Experts, all of which seem
to
contradict each other, and for that reason, we would ask the state to, or excuse me, ask the
He's
court
interesting. He's got that Australian accent. Oi, the airways are in the front of your neck, not the back. That was not a good. That's not Australian. That wasn't. I don't know what that was. Oi, cunt. Oi. His airways weren't restricted,
The state
cunt.
opposes the defendant's
Oi.
motion for a judgment of acquittal.
His knee was not like the shrimp on the barbie.
As we presented it, establishes. all
Me
of the
ears are
elements
like
involved in
Dumbo's ears.
charged
I
in
can
the
fly away.
Defense of reasonable use of force. The issue is not.
The dude does
whether
have Dumbo
there are,
ears.
Inconsistencies, minor inconsistencies in what witnesses say.
Like,
The
if you
issue
just
is
look at
whether,
this little thumbnail
taken as a whole, the state
down
has
there,
proved
you
its
can
case
tell.
in terms of the force analysis or reasonable force. There's no question that the witnesses who have testified have all opined that the defendants.
Now let me answer your question, Mr. Nelson, with a question of me own.
He did not follow policy.
The
he did not follow
dingo.
procedure,
Did the dingo eat
and
your
The
baby?
force that he exercised was unnecessary under the circumstances and simply continued on. As to the medical causation issue, Your Honor, the state has introduced evidence that, if believed by a reasonable jury, clearly established.
Maybe the
defendant's
dingo
conduct was a
ate your
causal factor
baby.
in bringing about Mr. Floyd's death through the pulmonologist, through Dr. Baker, through the other witnesses who testified. And so, taken as a whole, the state believes that it's established and will establish beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, if you
that
look at the
defendant is guilty.
airways on the dingo,
Thank you.
it clearly goes straight from the mother's neck down directly into the baby.
I'm going to deny the defense motion for judgment of acquittal. I would note the standard, unlike a jury which has to decide whether the case has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and in doing so must presume the defendant innocent. The court's duty at this point is to look at the evidence in a light most favorable to the state. And even when there are inconsistencies, major or minor, between witnesses, the jury is free to believe some and not the others. And when viewing a set of facts in a light most favorable to the state, they could give their greatest weight to those witnesses who establish that the use of force was unreasonable and that the cause of death was positional asphyxia or lack of oxygen, however the state wishes to characterize it, but most importantly that it was caused by the defendant. That is viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the state. It is clear that that has been established, and so based on that standard, the motion for judgment of acquittal is denied. All right. I
Did
think we
somebody
told
steal my tea and my crumpets?
counsel for Mr. Hall to
The
be
thing about
available
English
at
is that there's like
9 o'clock.
14 different
Did
variations of
anyone
English. The one that doesn't say the
address
T's.
Any issues other than that?
Somebody steal my tea and crumpets. I can't. Who stole my tea and my crumpets?
All right.
It's all good. It's all.
Is Mr. Hall present? Okay. Why don't we invite them in?
Middle finger gesture. What, did the lawyer do it?
They can all go over there.
Skip.
And now Mr. Isaacman, Ms. Cousins, and Mr. Hall are now present to determine if Mr. Hall will testify.
Oh, damn.
Did either counsel wish to be heard before I inquire of Mr.
Hall.
Hall?
Are they going to make him testify?
Cousins, if you could
Kappas,
come
what's
up
going
to
on,
the podium.
baby? Hey. I was just thinking about you. Literally just thinking about you. I know you changed your name on Twitch. Did that get shut down?
Good morning, Your Honor.
I know you're on
I'm
Trovo
President
now.
Jeff Isaac,
Where are
the
you
hearing
streaming,
on
my
behalf of
friend?
Mr. Hall,
Also-
who again is present in the courtroom.
I wanted to let you know something. I'm starting it's not secret, but it's an exclusive Discord channel for Patriot streamers, dude. And so I'm gonna be in it. Crooked Nose, Joey, this dude named Brant for Liberty, who's like a libertarian. I may or may not invite him because he's not a Patriot streamer. But where we can all talk about what's going on with our channels. We can like give each other information, shout each other out. We can collab on shit, record YouTube videos, and all hang out and talk there. So look forward to that. Because I'll contact you on Discord about that when I set that up. It's in the
Your
works
Honor,
right now.
Where we last left off at the last hearing was you had instructed defense counsel to submit a list of questions on a very narrow topic to see whether or not Mr. Hall could answer a very narrowly tailored set of questions, and whether or not his Fifth Amendment privilege would be implicated in those questions. I've had a chance to review those questions, Judge. I've reviewed
Atlas.
them with Mr. Hall, and to summarize,
Just so you
Mr. Hall
know,
cannot answer
everyone's
any
chatting on
questions
YouTube
that
right
the
now.
defense put forward.
Hold on, let me see if I can put the
And
chat
I'm
up.
happy to expand on the reasons why he can't answer any of those questions.
Let's just focus on
There you go.
how Mr. Floyd looked.
Now you can read what everyone else is
That was
saying from
very
DLive, and
limited
people on
group of
YouTube can read
questions
the
that I
people on
thought
DLive are
might
saying.
Not incriminate him.
Absolutely, Judge. And if you look at the list that defense proposed, I think that really starts getting into that topic at question 7. So question 7 proposed by the defense was, after conducting your business in Cup Foods, did you return to the vehicle with Mr. Floyd? Mr. Hall cannot answer that question. Mr. Hall cannot put himself in that car with Mr. Floyd. Again, this was a car that was searched twice.
Alice said a shouting
and
crowd also
covered
killed
twice.
Jesus. They
If
did
Mr.
the
Hall puts himself in that
face.
car, he exposes himself to constructive possession charges of the drugs that were found in that car. And it's important to note, Judge, that Mr. Hall exposes himself to that charge whether or not Mr. Chauvin is convicted or acquitted. Whatever happens with this case, the state can still come back and charge Mr. Hall with constructive possession of drugs in that car, so he can't put himself in that car. Furthermore, the questions that come after that: did you notice a change in Mr. Floyd's behavior while sitting in the car? How would you describe his behavior? Did you tell BCA agents that Mr. Floyd was drowsy or asleep? Mr. Hall cannot answer any of those questions without potentially incriminating himself. We discussed this at the last hearing, Judge, but there's a potential third-degree murder liability here under that overdose statute, which again is very broad. If Mr. Hall puts himself in that car, he's now establishing a timeline of events. So let's say Mr. Hall takes the stand. He very limitedly testifies to, this is what Mr. Floyd was doing. This is how Mr. Floyd looked. These were his behaviors. This is the change in his behaviors. Let's say Mr. Chauvin is then acquitted. He is now given the state on a silver platter testimony to use against him in a third-degree murder charge if they decide to bring it.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Hall, I'm going to have you step up to the podium because I'm going to ask you a few questions, basically whether you are going to invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege. So if you could swap places with your attorney. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
You understand, Mr. Hall, you do have a Fifth Amendment right not to be compelled to incriminate yourself. You understand that?
Yes.
All right. And you understand that applies even when you are not one of the parties to the case, but when you're a witness in a trial. Do you understand that?
Yes.
You understand that your attorney, and I'm sure they have given you advice about whether to invoke your Fifth Amendment right against compelled self-incrimination. But ultimately, it's your choice. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you'll have to speak up just a little bit, and I'll turn up the podium. There we go. You understand this is your choice, so you could disregard the advice of your attorneys if you wanted to.
Yes, sir.
Knowing all that, you've had a chance to look at the questions that were proposed by both sides?
I have.
Would you be willing to answer those if I were to put you on the stand and swear you in as a witness?
No, I am not.
Okay, and why would you not answer those?
I'm fearful of criminal charges going forward. I have open charges that's not settled yet of my personal stuff.
So basically
Thanks,
you are
Hey
in
Kappas,
your
for that.
Fifth Amendment right against
I also
compelled
just hit like on my own video.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you, sir. You can have a seat. Any of the parties wish to be heard on this issue? I think we've had argument already, just in case there's anything else.
Damn, I was wishing they were gonna make him
All
talk.
right, I'm going to advise both sides to file your proposed questions as essentially an offer of proof on what you would have asked Mr. Hall. But I am finding that he has a complete Fifth Amendment privilege here. I had earlier said that possibly he could talk about how Mr. Floyd looked in the car, but counsel's argument is persuasive that that could provide a link. And since it's not just evidence that would incriminate a person, but also provide a link to incriminating evidence, I do find that his invocation of his Fifth Amendment rights is valid, and accordingly I am going to quash the subpoena. Anything else? All right. Thank you.
Damn, I was hoping they're going to make that guy talk.
Here,
You uploaded crazy vids on your channel. Check them out when you have time. All right. I'm uploading the first episode of the Shizcast later today. Recorded last night with the one and only Plukester.
Let Mr. Schaefer know.
And I also recorded a couple hours of a video game that I'm going to not edit and fully upload called Disco Elysium, the Final Cut. So, last night during when I normally would have streamed, it was my brother's birthday and we went out to dinner, so I didn't have time to do real stream, so I just did a little bit of extra shit.
Everyone, we're going to proceed with the defense case. Mr. Nelson.
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. David Fowler.
So look forward to those episodes coming forward. What mic? It's called a Blue Yeti. Except for it always DCs itself. So I'm going to pick it up and show you, and then I bet you it's going to disconnect. Check, check, check. Oh, it's working. Check, check, check. Oh, it's working. Hell yeah.
You swear or affirm under penalty of perjury. Testimony about to give.
The only thing that sucks about it is the cord.
I do.
You have a seat, please.
Thank you very much.
But it's cheap. It's a good cheap mic for streaming. Not the best.
Let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
My full name is David Richard Fowler.
Here he is.
D-A-V-I-D, Richard R-I-C-H-A-R-D, Fowler F-O-W-L-E-R.
You got the Wave 3? I don't know what that is. I'll look it up. Did I win or lose in Vegas?
Fowler,
I won.
Presently employed.
I am...
A couple $100.
Okay. Could you tell the jury a little bit about what you did prior to your retirement?
Wave 3 mic.
Prior to my retirement, I have been full-time in
Bro,
forensic
that mic looks
pathology
good.
since about 1986, which is when I first started training in that discipline. And I have been full-time within that discipline for 30-some years, whatever that number is.
Where did you work prior to retirement?
I worked at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner.
Dude, they're like the
State
same
Medical.
price of mic. This one might actually be cheaper than the one I got, the one that I have.
Do you have any other employment, either before your retirement or subsequent to your retirement?
No, they're like the same
Yes,
price.
I would do,
They're probably equal
the
quality,
official
buddy.
Consultation case during the time prior to my retirement, and I have done some since my retirement.
The Wave 3 might be better. I don't
Tell
know
us a
much
little
about
bit
it, but
your education,
looks
and
great.
background.
Certainly. I graduated from the University of Cape Town in South Africa in 1983. I did a year of internship in general medicine and general surgery. That's required in South Africa before you can get a medical license.
South Africa.
I then followed that with a year of training in pediatric pathology at the Red Cross Children's Hospital in Cape Town. And completing that year, I entered a full-time 5-year
John,
training
is this better?
program at the University of Cape Town in forensic pathology.
And are you board certified?
I am. And so the system in South Africa is that you eventually graduate with a Master of Medicine in your discipline. So I ended up with a Master of Medicine in forensic pathology, which qualifies you in the South African system to be what they call a specialist, which in this country is the same as an attending physician, just different terminology. But that's equivalent to board certification here. When I came to the United States, I felt it was very important to get an American qualification if I was going to work in this country full-time. And so I went back, and the American Board of Pathology demands that all pathology training is done in the United States or Canada. So, if I wanted to do that and be eligible for their examination process, I had to then go back and retrain. So I went to the University of Maryland for 2 years to complete additional anatomic pathology training to qualify me for that portion of the examination process, and then 2 years of forensic pathology training at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. I then took my board examinations through the American Board of Pathology in anatomic and forensic pathology, and passed those exams.
Great. So how did your career progress after you received all of that education?
So at about the time that I finished my training, I was recruited full-time into the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner as an assistant medical examiner. And that was, I would have to look at my CV to be absolutely certain, 95 or 96, somewhere in that range.
Are you a licensed physician in the United States?
Yes, I am.
Now, you were educated in large part in South Africa, but then also here in the United States. Are there some differences between the degrees, or are they the same?
They're different letters after your name. But so if you go through the system which is derived from the old British examination process, you end up with a MB, CHB, and some of them have different letters, which basically mean you have 2 bachelor's degrees, a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. And it's a 6-year training program, not a 4-year training program like you have in the United States. Just different ways of getting to the same end point. If you want to work as a physician in the United States, you have to go through a process which, when I went through it, was run by the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. And they make an assessment as to whether or not the university that you went to meets the appropriate standards. And these are all universities that are approved by the World Health Organization as meeting certain standards. Once you've been approved and your university is recognized, then you have to go through a set of board examinations which are very similar to all US graduates graduating from a US university. So nowadays they are known as the USMLE examination. So we go through exactly the same process for evaluation. And then you can you can apply for a medical license in the United States based on that process.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. And in terms of, just to clarify, you are a licensed physician?
Yes, I am.
All right. And you have board certifications in forensic pathology and anatomic pathology, that's correct?
Yes, I do.
And you worked as a pathologist or a forensic pathologist in the United States since approximately 1995?
So that's when I qualified and finished my training in the United States. But I was working as a pathologist all the way from the time I arrived in 1991. So I've had uninterrupted work within pathology all the way from 1990, when I started my training in pediatric pathology at the Red Cross Children's Hospital, which was probably back in 1985. But some of that is training, so the question is whether you want to count that as being a pathologist or just a trainee pathologist.
Okay. What is a pathologist? How would you describe that to the jury?
Typically, the pathologist that most people will not come across because they work in the laboratory in a hospital. And they are the individuals who will run the laboratories, and those laboratories are the ones that take the samples which are taken from individuals during treatment by the surgeons and other clinicians, physicians, and do the analysis on those. So blood specimens, urine specimens, and then any biopsies or surgical specimens that are removed from an individual are analyzed in the laboratory by a pathologist. And that is the anatomic pathology training, as well as some of that is clinical pathology.
Can you tell the jury a little bit about your work with the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office?
Yes. So, having finished my training in forensic pathology, I was recruited, became an assistant medical examiner, did that for several years, and then was offered the position of deputy chief medical examiner. And in Maryland they have 2 deputies, one which is in charge of autopsy services, and one which is in charge of statewide services. So the one in charge of autopsy services focuses most of their work on supervising the autopsy process and the staff that are doing that, as well as continuing to do autopsies themselves. Statewide services.
All right,
is
nice.
The individual
You're in the
who
UK.
then looks at the investigation.
Which means when you get on mic,
so this is a big jurisdiction.
I
here in
can do an
Minneapolis.
imitation of you
Maryland,
later.
The population served by the medical examiner's office is about 6 million people.
On
It's
my
the entire
stream.
state out of one office.
Happy smiley
So we have
face.
a lot of investigators out in the counties doing work.
But you can
and
also do your impression of me,
coordination
though,
and
too.
supervision of
You
that
can
goes
say,
to the deputy chief for
I'm an American. Give me a hamburger. You know, it could be fun for you.
statewide services.
And I'll be like,
So having been the
cheerio,
deputy
my
chief
name
for
is Hey
autopsy
Cappers,
services
mate.
for several years.
What's up
chief
in the morning
medical
to ya?
examiner asked me then to take over statewide services, which I did for several years.
You don't see how
I
fun
was
this could
in
be?
that position when he suddenly passed away. So the health department asked me to act as the interim or acting chief medical examiner until they could find somebody to take the position.
And how long did you act as the chief medical examiner?
So I was acting chief medical examiner for about a year, and after a national search, the health department appointed me into the position as chief medical examiner. So I believe that was 2002.
So, just an idea,
2003.
man.
About 2003, if I remember correctly.
Okay. And you served
Telling you,
in
get that webcam,
capacity
too.
until your retirement?
Yes, it was about 17 years in that position.
So what type of work is done at the medical examiner's office? I mean, you've explained kind of the differences in the statewide versus the autopsies.
So the difference between
The
what's done in the
difference?
hospital
What's the
and what's
difference,
done at a medical examiner's
Professor?
office is, in the hospital, the pathologists are looking largely at natural disease. There will be some traumatic specimens come from trauma patients, but most of what they're doing is looking at natural disease. The forensic pathologist is an individual who's gone on to do that additional training in wound patterns and other non-natural events that threaten life and cause death. So at the end of the process,
You will not sound like
you
a
have
pirate.
the knowledge base of all the natural diseases that a general pathologist has.
Americans love the Beatles. Ed Sheeran. For Americans, for ladies, guys with accents sound sexy to them. People love that shit. Stop being all self-conscious, man. You got it. You're good.
Plus the additional training to evaluate how
And
people
look at what
die
Gigi says.
in
Women love
unusual
pirates.
circumstances,
Arrgh!
sudden deaths while not attended, or any deaths
Women
which
love
are
Johnny
traumatic.
Depp on the fucking pirate shit,
That's
man.
the
Come on
additional
now.
training.
Get it
That
together, man.
Portion is what's done at a medical examiner's office, are these sudden, unexpected deaths. And so the best way of thinking of a medical examiner's office is a 24-hour emergency medical institution. People die all the time. It's got to be available 24 hours. All of these deaths, you need to respond to them rapidly and appropriately and in a dignified way. So it's a 24-hour emergency medical institution
Yay.
with the one responsibility at the end of the day of making a determination of the cause of death of the individual that has suddenly died.
In addition to your work at the medical examiner's office, did you also do some teaching?
Yes.
Where?
So I've taught at the University of Maryland. I'm a professor in both pediatrics and pathology at that particular institution. I've taught at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. I've taught
The
at
Johns
multiple
Hopkins
hospitals in
Hospital.
the Maryland, D.C. area. I've taught at the FBI Academy.
I've taught at the FBI Academy.
I've been invited as a guest lecturer and or visiting professor
No.
at multiple universities internationally.
So what
In
kind of
terms
English
your
are
work
you?
As the chief
Which are the
pathologist, did you also
versions of
train other
dialect of
forensic
English?
pathologists?
Like in America,
Yes.
there's Southern,
So for a portion of
Baltimore,
my career,
New York,
while I was an assistant medical
Midwest, which
examiner,
I have,
I was
Valley
directly
Girl,
responsible for training the forensic
Moonshiner,
pathologist. In other words,
all
when a
that.
forensic pathologist trainee, what we would call a fellow, is doing a case, I would be directly supervising everything that they did on that case. and it would be my responsibility to ensure that that case was done correctly. And so it's almost like an apprenticeship, and they are standing, they're going to do the case, but you're going to be watching carefully and evaluating every single part of that process as they gradually grow through that learning curve to become a forensic pathologist. So for a while I was hands-on actually teaching at the autopsy table. When I became deputy chief, I continued to do that, but one of the roles that was assigned to me was the residency director position for the office. And so that is the position where you supervise the residency.
Devon accent, Southwest England.
How that program is accredited and evaluated by an outside agency.
Hey,
so
Jonathan,
push
push redeem first.
all of those requirements are done. So
Put exclamation point redeem space. There you go.
So were you responsible for recruiting the residents and things of that nature?
Recruiting, evaluating, bringing them in, and then obviously training, evaluating. And at the end of the process, each of those
Get me
fellows,
what you want to do. What you want to do.
require that
What
the
you gonna
institution
do when they come for you?
complete a declaration
All right.
that they have
I'm
met
looking
the
up
standards
your accent right
to
now.
practice, and that is before they can take the exam. So they are constantly evaluated daily, quarterly, and then at the end of the year to ensure that they have met the standards that we can attest to, so they are then qualified to take the examination through the American Board of Pathology.
And you've testified in cases before,
Yes,
state and federal,
yes,
civil and criminal.
yes.
Can you estimate how many times you've testified in cases over the course of your career?
Gosh, over the 30-some years, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times.
Now, have you ever published any articles or peer-reviewed journal type information?
I'm Sam, I'm from Devon, and I'm going to be teaching the West Country accent.
It has to be.
And I'm gonna be learning.
I haven't looked at my CV and counted them recently.
Okay. At the Office of the Chief Medical Examiners, do you review every homicide?
That was the policy, that the chief would get to review all homicides, all
I
pediatric
live
cases
in an
that were
house.
under the age of about 2 years.
I live in an
and
house.
any case which the medical examiner could not determine the cause of death.
Okay. And how many homicides did you review?
Typically, the number of homicides in Maryland each year would vary between 500 and 600. So that would be the homicides alone. And then the other cases that added on to that would add an additional load of perhaps 50 to 100 cases.
Soider. Soider.
So in this capacity, in this case, are you associated with an organization called the Forensics Panel?
Yes.
Can you just generally describe what the Forensics Panel is?
Cider.
The Forensic Panel
Cider.
is a national
Cider.
organization that
Yeah, fuck those cringe guys, man.
evaluates,
I'm with you on that, Jonathan. I agree.
looks at cases and does evaluations on cases in the forensic sciences, the medical sciences.
I don't know what you're talking
behavioral
about with the
sciences.
dumpster fire
So it's a
guy,
forensic
but
science
his channel was
organization
cringe. Was it
that
DK
looks at
Records?
those particular
I didn't watch him because
What
he
is
got
your
banned right
role
away.
with the Forensics Panel?
I am a forensic pathology consultant.
Was it
In terms of the Forensics Panel,
Live Now
what's
Media
unique
who
about how
quit?
that organization operates?
So the forensic panel really started the process of peer review evaluations in order to ensure that the case was diligently evaluated, objectively evaluated, and was based in the known science. So that's the first thing, and then it's peer review, and that has evolved over time.
Spudlin?
Then it's
DK
an
Records.
organization which
I'm not gonna talk
has
shit on
many
DK,
different disciplines
but I never really got to
recognized
see him. The only time I really
recognized
talked to
working
him
within it,
was
so
during
it's
a
multidisciplinary.
Friday U-turn on Joey's stream, and he seemed
You have
alright to me,
experts
but
in all sorts
I never
of
got to
different
watch his
fields
streams. I just
can
figured that's
be,
what you're talking about because I knew
assigned to the
he
case
did somewhat what I
depending
did,
on the
but
nature of the case. It's an independent organization.
got banned.
Is it similar to what's called an M&M conference?
A mortality and morbidity is what you're referring to. That is something
Spudlin.
very similar. that
Quit your
that happens in
smuddling.
the average hospital when a patient may have something adverse happen to them, not necessarily fatal. That's the morbidity part, or it is fatal, mortality.
It's crazy how many
And in those
DJs
circumstances,
are streaming protest
physicians
shit.
will present in
Who
a
knew
closed
that?
environment
That those two worlds are so
all
close
of
together.
materials and their evaluation, and the general physician population that have gone to that conference can sit down and critique it, evaluate it, and it's an opportunity for self-evaluation, learning for people, and quality assurance for the hospital program. Yes, it's similar.
How did you end up working within the forensic panel, and when?
About 15 years ago, I was approached by the forensic panel, and they indicated that another forensic pathologist had recommended me as somebody who might well fit
Oh no.
their program.
You guys are funny.
And so within the panel there, you described it as a
Hell yeah.
multidisciplinary approach. How does that?
I wonder if I can upload that YouTube
So,
video right now.
Depending on the nature
While
of the
live
case,
streaming.
the forensic panel will assign individuals that have skills in areas that the case apparently needs from an evaluation process. So
My internet is definitely good enough to do it.
And
So
you're compensated for your time?
I am.
And your hourly rate?
It's $350 an hour.
You at some point became involved in this case,
Oh,
State of Minnesota
sorry,
versus
chat.
Derek Chauvin.
stop.
I did.
And how did you become involved in this case?
The forensic panel, I was approached and asked to become part of it, and I felt that this was such a complex and difficult case that this would better fit working through the forensic panel than trying to handle this case independently. So I referred this case to the forensic panel.
And you were approached by me, correct?
I believe that was the first conversation I had, yes. It was a while back.
And you referred me to the forensics panel.
That's my recollection, yes.
Now, in terms of this particular case, how many of these peer reviewers were ultimately involved?
There were 13 peer reviewers across multiple disciplines that were involved in this case.
How is it useful for you to have those peer reviewers involved?
Well, several of the peer reviewers, I believe 7, are forensic pathologists. So my direct colleagues with the same training and skill set that you would expect a good forensic pathologist to have. There were additional individuals in behavioral health, pulmonologists, emergency room physicians, toxicologists that were present as part of the evaluation team because they have the detailed knowledge in those other areas that really helps critique any opinions that I may form and provide their expertise in ensuring that everything was looked at and that any opinion that is expressed is based in science.
What's the process that you apply in approaching a case such as this?
So the primary reviewer in a case like that will be provided all of the available information that has been given to the forensic panel. They will go through that material, study it, evaluate it, and then the peer reviewers are given a similar but sometimes slightly less onerous package of materials, but they are given similar materials. They will go through it.
So how was your
And
day?
then I
All right,
would,
good.
In this
It's
case,
gonna work.
as I did in this case, I've been a review pathologist on several, and in this case I was the primary. I will do a presentation to the forensic panel, and during that time they have the opportunity to evaluate and critique my opinion. Based on that, if there's additional information that is necessary in order to help refine the opinions, that request can go back to the forensic panel and through to whichever attorney, whether it be a prosecutor or a defense attorney, a plaintiff's attorney, or a defense attorney, requests for the appropriate additional information can be made, and if that information is available,
Southern.
sent back so we can
Just-
complete and try.
Real quick, if you want to see me do my Southern accent, on this YouTube, there are videos of James Smith, the RP, GTA RP cowboy, and that's me doing a Southern accent.
And ensure that we haven't missed anything.
Hey, Kappas. See you
So there
later,
may be
man.
several reviews along the way.
Good luck
And at
with
some
everything,
point,
and I hope to talk to you again soon. And again, that Discord, I'll talk to you about it later.
Cyber.
Alright. I'm back. They're in a sidebar. Let's fast forward through this. Sidebar. Damn, the longest sidebar of all time. Alright, there we go.
Yeah, not sure who that is.
All right. Dr. Fowler, are you familiar with NAME?
Yes, I am.
And what is NAME?
NAME is the National Association of Medical Examiners.
And are you a member of NAME?
I am.
So is that technically a
Have you held any leadership
South African
positions
accent?
in that organization?
I have, yes.
Can you?
That'd be Elon
let me
Musk's
ask you this.
accent.
Does NAME have an inspection and accreditation process,
Yes, it does.
or committee, I should say?
Yes, it has a committee which does that particular task for the organization.
What is the responsibility of the inspection and accreditation committee?
To evaluate medical examiner and coroner officers. It's a voluntary program, and basically it means that the medical examiner's office, once they've passed that evaluation and been accredited, have met certain standards that the National Association of Medical Examiners Board of Directors believe are appropriate for the office to have in order to ensure the safety of both the staff that work in the office and also the community that they serve.
Are you a member of that committee?
I am now, and I was a previous chairman of that committee.
Fuck.
Does
Jesus
NAME
Christ,
have a
chat,
standards
sorry.
committee?
I'm gonna mute myself next time I
It
rip
does.
that.
Right now, they are two separate committees.
And
Previously, they were both inspection and standards were under one committee. At the time, I was the chairperson of that.
Chairperson.
And how?
But it's now been separated off into two separate ones.
Gotcha. How are the standards approved?
Yeah. I don't know. It might be
So the
South
standards
African
are
accent.
different. As I said, the accreditation checklist is approved by the board of directors. The standards are a grassroots process where any member of NAME can suggest a standard. That is then put out to the general population of members of NAME, and then those are discussed and voted on at the annual general meeting in the business meeting. And so therefore anybody out of the hundreds of pathologists that are present at that meeting can stand up and address and debate those particular standards, and then at some point a vote is called by the chairman of the standards committee as to whether or not that standard would be included or not. And so therefore it's approved by the general membership, not by the board of directors.
And one last question before we move on. When were those standards approved?
The initial standards started out in 2005, and then they get updated on a regular basis because medical knowledge changes, and therefore one needs to keep them appropriate and fresh.
Can you tell me generally what a death investigation is and what it involves?
Yes, a death investigation is very much like any other medical examination.
Medical.
But specifically looking at individuals obviously who have died. So there is gathering of information from the scene of the death. And that is somewhat to replace the information
do something.
that a patient would give to their doctor when you walk into
turn off the D-Live chat for the time
examination
being.
with your doctor. The first question they'll ask you is, why are you here today? Well, deceased people can't speak. And so therefore, the scene information really replaces some of that information. You gather the scene information, you gather past medical records, you then start gathering information from all sorts of pertinent sources. That will be the ambulance or EMT run sheets, the hospital information if the person made it to the hospital, the current medical information, the past medical information. There will be witness statements, there will be police records, videos, everything that is available and pertinent will usually be gathered as part of that process.
Would it also include things like specimens that are collected?
Yes, so if a specimen is taken in the hospital, that will be taken. If clothing is available in the hospital and removed from the person during resuscitation, that may well be gathered as well. You know, all and everything that is reasonably available that could potentially define how the case may be evaluated at the end will be gathered as is reasonable. So yes, hospital specimens. If the person, for instance, went into surgery and a specimen was removed from them during the surgical procedure,
If you take a dude snap, it's this dude's
to
fault.
try and save their life, that would also be requested. So there's lots of things that...
Hold on.
And is there then ultimately a result?
I wish I
in the
could
death
draw on my
certificate?
screen.
Well, there's a long process which goes on before that.
I wish I
How
could
long
draw
is that
like a
process?
mustache
So,
on that
yeah,
guy
the
and some
process will
hair.
include an autopsy,
Draw some hair on
which
him,
is
maybe
an
a
external
big horn.
examination of the person, an internal examination
Draw a
of the
big,
person,
big old
maybe
mustache.
X-rays of
Make
the
his ears
person,
bigger.
CT scans of the person depending on the
Put some
resources
cool sunglasses on him.
and needs of the case. Additional specimens will be
You
taken
know,
at the time of autopsy.
give him a
to look
patch
at
on his
under the
suit, coloring his
microscope
tie a little
and
bit.
Send off to a toxicology laboratory. And I'm talking very generally. Every case is going to be different. At the end of that process, you
Give him
begin
a crazy
the
beard.
evaluation of the case. In complex cases, certain specimens will be retained and often sent to an expert
I meant
in
walk.
that particular area.
Walk, not talk.
So some officers have access to a neuropathologist who specializes in looking at brains and spinal cords. So if you have that resource, and it's a case where that really may well assist in getting the additional detail that a specialist who only looks at that can provide, then you will save that specimen and have them look at it in conjunction with you. So it's usually an examination of the two with that extra expertise at the same time.
Are there other factors or other processes that occur?
Yes, and you know, some offices have access to cardiac pathologists. The Maryland office does, and so in many of these complex cases, the heart would be retained and examined by a cardiac pathologist. And you have in fairness, the general forensic pathologist has a substantial body of knowledge and is very good at identifying most things, but there are cases when somebody who only
I don't know how to
looks
draw
at
on the
that
screen,
one
sorry.
organ is going to have a better eye for detail in that particular area. And so you can do that. Not all officers have access to those resources, but if you have, that's a good thing. So those all add time to waiting for those examinations to be done and the results to be sent back so they can be put into the evaluation matrix, and the jigsaw puzzle of all of the information that you're trying to include, as well as the toxicology results, which take a while to come back, the microscopic examination, which the pathologist will do themselves. It takes a while for the glass slides. So some cases can take 2 to 3 months. And NAME actually has a requirement that you should complete 90% of your cases within 90 days. Otherwise, you cannot be accredited. They prefer you to do it within 60 days, but 90% of cases should be completed within 90 days. And that's 3 months. And the 10% of cases that aren't completed with it
Thank
are
you
going
so
to
much
be
to-
very complex cases. Often the deaths in custody
second.
and the pediatric sudden deaths are the ones that fall into that 10%. So they often go out even further.
Guy Delegoff
as
donated
you
$5.
gather all of that information.
Appreciate you streaming
Thank you.
this for us.
So,
Hard,
can
hard,
you explain
hard.
what the death certificate is? Thank
Thank you so much. I didn't really catch that name, so I'm gonna go look it up.
Correct.
But thank you so
And
much
can
for
you
that
explain what the
$5.
death
Big
certificate
hearts.
So the death certificate is a document that is produced by a physician. The greater majority of them are
Hold on a
signed out
second
by
here.
physicians within the hospital or nursing home, etc., when people die of natural deaths. Medical examiners are usually exposed to about 25% of deaths within their jurisdiction.
Shout out to GG Dillegaff. Oh,
Yes,
the name
to
just
the
read it all weird with the robot
person
sound.
has died.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you so much, GG.
The certifying
Yes.
physician believes that whatever
Thank
is on
you.
the cause of death line
I appreciate
is
you so much.
the cause of death within a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
So let me ask you, in terms of this particular case, you've reviewed
Shout out to
a
Gigi.
substantial amount of information.
Yes.
Can you just briefly describe the information you've reviewed in this case?
Gosh, it goes on for several pages, but there are past medical records, the records that occurred in the hospital at or about the time that the attempted resuscitation of Mr. Floyd occurred. There are ambulance records, there are police records, there's toxicology information. There are multiple videos from multiple sources, both body-worn cameras, surveillance videos from stores,
Hell yeah.
and other facilities.
Oh,
in that
Streamlabs said
area.
it in that chat.
There
Look at
was
that.
Video material from observers that is available. There's the toxicological data. There's the autopsy information, the autopsy photographs, the microscopic examination. It goes on and on and on. There is a substantial amount of information on this case.
And before we kind of get back to the death certificate in this particular case, upon your review and based upon your training and education, your experience as a forensic pathologist, have you formed opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
We'll come back to those shortly. So in terms of the death certificate, are there two parts to that?
Yes.
And can you explain those two parts?
So the first part is what the physician believes to be the cause of death. So that is something that you will put what we call part one. That's what the CDC refers to it. The death certification process is one which is controlled and governed by the CDC, although each state will have a slightly different format to their death certificate and the way they do things. The guidelines that are put out there by the CDC for completion of death certification are certainly ones that are national.
So what's the first part of the death certification according to the CDC?
Well, the first part is the primary cause of
Butterfly Tricks that
And
song.
what's the second part for the CDC?
Alright.
other significant
Possibly
conditions
in a little bit.
contributing to death,
Still kind of early.
but not directly related to
We're
what's
going to save that maybe
Now,
For
I'm going to
later on.
ask, like to show Exhibit 193.
But I got that right here,
which is already
John.
in evidence.
Right here in the old noggin.
You see that in front of you and ask to publish.
Yeah, man. Gigi, thank you so much. Appreciate you. Very sweet of you to do that.
You're familiar with this document?
I have seen this document, yes.
And what
Like
is
a
the
full-on disco club?
first part
Damn, dude.
of the
That's pretty sweet.
certification of death?
So the first part here, the cause of death, is cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Now, under that, there's a phrase that says underlying. Is that what you're talking about in terms of the second part per the CDC?
No, the way the CDC normally phrases it is you can break it out into multiple lines. So it could be cardiac arrhythmia due to such and such, due to such and such. And so that's where the underlying conditions come into the death certificate. At least, when you look at the CDC guidelines and the death certificates that I'm used to completing. The second part that I refer to as Part 2 on this death certificate is called Other Contributing Conditions.
And what are the other contributing conditions that you review here?
And so on this particular death certificate, the certification says that atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, fentanyl intoxication, and recent methamphetamine use are considered contributing conditions.
So this was prepared by Dr. Baker, correct?
Yes, that is my understanding, that he was the individual who certified this case.
So in terms of Dr. Baker's analysis of this case, how did the heart and drugs contribute to the cause of death?
They were significant, or they contributed to Mr. Floyd having a sudden cardiac arrest, in my opinion. That's how I would read it.
Okay. So I'm going to take this down. If we could unpublish, sorry. Doctor, did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation to walk through your opinions in this case?
Yes.
Judge, I've identified this as demonstrative exhibit 1098, and I've moved to publish.
Any objection to 1098 for demonstrative purposes only.
All right, if anyone's got a
It is
water
received for that purpose
or an
only.
iced tea, or
So
Gatorade,
before we,
soda,
begin,
or if you got a beer,
Doctor,
any other alcoholic
you
beverage, pick that shit up.
Summarize briefly what your
Cheers it up.
opinions are in this case.
Say it. 1, 2, 3. Cheers.
Yes.
Ah.
So
That
in
feels
my
good.
opinion, Mr. Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia, or cardiac arrhythmia.
As you can see, I'm still feeling very lazy,
due
chat.
to his atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, or you can write
I'm
that
gonna
down
stream on
multiple
Twitch
ways.
tonight, and we'll amp up the energy.
During his restraint. And sexual
This is
violence
relaxation.
restrained by police.
Watching the trial
And his
with some people, having
significant
friends
contributory conditions
in the stream. You
would
guys.
be, since I've already put
watching
heart
this shit,
disease
you know
in
how it
part
is.
1, he would have
You have to put a shirt on
the
so you can go get your
toxicology of
delivery.
fentanyl
LOL.
and methamphetamine.
You don't have to.
There is
This does let it
exposure
pour
to
so much.
a
Started
vehicle
doing X in
exhaust.
college. Oh god.
so
You used to do
potentially
10
carbon
pills, oh my
monoxide
God.
poisoning, or at least an effect from increased
Yeah, college.
carbon monoxide in his
That's when you
bloodstream,
do all that shit for
and
sure.
paraganglionoma, or
Go to class
the
smelling like
natural
puke.
disease process that he has. So,
Hey man, it is what it is.
all of those combined to cause Mr. Floyd's death.
All right. So let's walk through each of these, if we could.
If you're on X,
Starting
you'd be feeling
with
the tip of this
opinions
hat right
Dr.
now.
Baker as far
Like I'm
as
doing.
the cardiopulmonary arrest. Before we do that, if we could publish.
Don't do drugs, that's right.
The exhibit.
I agree with Jonathan. Drugs are bad, don't do them. Nothing
Can
good
you
comes from
just
doing
describe
drugs.
What this
See what we're
is
watching here? This is what
and
happens.
Why it's relevant to this case.
Dead or jail. Only two good
So
outcomes.
this is a document that is produced as a guide for medical examiners to use when certifying the death, and specifically the manner of death.
What is the manner of death?
So the manner of death is, how did the cause of death come about? And you have 5 different choices that you can check off or write down on a death certificate as to the manner of death.
Now, does this document specifically address asphyxial deaths?
Are you studying hard?
Positional asphyxia deaths?
It addresses all sorts of manner of death.
Engineering is not
And
easy.
again, it's a guideline put out there to assist medical examiners. And unfortunately, not every case cleanly fits into one particular category or meets the criteria for the guidelines.
So let's talk about, in terms of this second slide, positional restraint. How does NAME deal with the autopsies and death investigations involving potential positional restraint?
So the recommendation is that, well, it's not a recommendation. They say you may be classified as a homicide.
Downtown Toronto.
It doesn't say shall.
Nice.
Or should. It says may be classified as a homicide. Again, we have to recognize that these are medical guidelines.
Drake is huge there, right?
And it then goes on, and everybody
Listen
can
to a little
actually
Drake.
easily read that.
They play the Drake songs at the hockey games.
In such cases, there may not be intent to kill.
But yeah, you must be pretty smart, man.
Death results from one or more intentional,
That's pretty
volitional, potentially
Definitely make
harmful
sure you
acts directed
pass.
at the decedent without consent.
Don't fuck it
of course.
off.
Further, there is some value to the homicide classification towards reducing the public perception that a cover-up
I was
is being
kidding about the
perpetrated
Drake
by
shit,
death
dude.
investigation agency.
Now, in terms of the 5 manners of death that you described, again, we've heard testimony, or the jury has heard testimony from other experts who've testified. There's homicide as one, suicide. Can you describe the others?
So homicide, suicide, accident, natural, and then undetermined.
So this
Toronto
next slide, can you
Argonauts.
describe what undetermined means according to the guidelines?
So
Isn't that
according to the guidelines,
football team?
undetermined, or the other term on some death certificates is could not be
CFL
determined,
team?
is a classification that's used when the information pointing to one manner of death is no more compelling than one or more other competing manners of death, in thorough consideration of all available information.
And the guidelines also define homicide.
Yes. And again, homicide occurs when a death results from a volitional act, in other words, an act a person did, committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. Intent to cause death is a common element, but is not required for classification as a homicide, or below. It is to be emphasized that the classification of homicide for the purposes of death certification is a neutral term, and neither indicates nor implies criminal intent, which remains the determination within the province of a legal process.
Why is that second part important?
Because this is a medical opinion.
Yeah, Doug Flutie, man.
That
Doug Flutie
is
was
on
the
a death
shit.
certificate.
Hell yeah.
The manners of death
Shout
are
out Doug Flutie.
unique.
He's a quarterback,
Virtually unique to the United
short,
States
but
of
he
America.
also could do drop kicks
These
where
were
you
put on
drop
the
the
death
ball
certificate
and smack it
by
through the
Center for
uprights.
Disease
Pretty
Control
sweet.
in order to gather information as to how Americans died or die for epidemiological purposes, and to study and try and prevent deaths. They are not meant to usurp any kind of legal process. And in fact, in many circumstances, regardless of what the medical examiner puts on a death certificate in the way of a manner, the legal system can and will act in a completely independent and different format.
Okay. Now, again, we discussed a little bit about the CDC death certificates, the instructions. Is this the guideline by the CDC?
Yes.
And it's
I think the
to
sketchy
enter all
website I got
diseases
this-
or conditions
Holy shit.
contributing to the death.
PT
of
News
or
got
not
big balls. He
reported
just got
to
unbanned and now he's
In
like
part one, in the first
streaming this
first
murder
conference.
trial
Now,
on Twitch.
Back to.
What if he shows those videos and shit?
Take this down.
Like the
for a moment,
evidence?
Your Honor.
Videos?
So,
Nah,
with
because
respect
that won't be
to
good.
Dr. Baker's autopsy, I just want to talk a little bit about the cardiopulmonary arrest that he references. What are the findings that were relevant to your analysis in this particular case?
There are substantial pertinent negatives in this particular case that drove my opinion.
Yo,
What
Kappa's never
about
told
the
me where
size
you're
of the
streaming now.
So there are, again, certain pertinent positive issues. Mr. Floyd's heart was enlarged. There are multiple methods and studies that have been done on the size of the heart in the United States. There's one study out of the medical examiner's office in San Antonio, Dr. Molina and DeMaio, where they took a series of individuals who died suddenly with trauma and hopefully eliminated, as part of that process, natural disease that might have caused alterations in the heart size.
Excuse me, doctor. Did you prepare a slide relevant to this, and if we could publish
Yes,
it?
I did.
Okay. So the Molina study you were referencing?
Right. So in their study, they found that 95% of males had a heart rate of between 233 and 383 grams. Anybody outside of those limits, and you would expect about 2.5% to be lower and 2.5% to be higher. That's the 95% certainty on either side of the mean. And so that is what they proposed as being the reference range for adult males.
Now, how about the Mayo study?
So the Mayo study is one where you can go in and calculate the weight based on the size of the individual, which is potentially more accurate, because you don't really want to take 130 pound 5'5" male and say, and plug them into a particular range. You'd expect their heart to be smaller, as most of their organs would be smaller. And Mr. Floyd was a very tall, robust-looking individual, so I would expect him to have a larger heart. And so
I'm back from vacation. That is correct.
Study where they put
Welcome
in
back. Thank you.
the sex of the individual, male, the height.
There's
and
a lot
the
of
weight,
points scored by the
and
prosecution
then come out
while I was
with
away. Yeah, I
a calculation,
caught up with it, but
accounting for that.
not
The
as much as I
95th
wanted to.
inclusion rate. would
I really
top
wanted
out
to
at
watch this
510
today because
grams.
the
in the
the witnesses
circumstance.
being called are now by
So Mr. Floyd's heart weight at 540 is outside
the
this range.
defense.
I will tell you, there are multiple studies. There's another one out of Chicago and Northwestern University.
Hey, Cap is on D line.
Which has
Okay,
even
thank
broader
you. He
range.
did say that.
And would indicate
He
that
did
Mr.
say
Floyd
that.
is
I remember now.
95 center,
He said
still
that.
right up at the very top end of normal.
Thank you,
Bottom
Gigi.
line is, he has an enlarged heart.
Okay. If we
By the
can,
way, you guys know
publish this
Jansen in my chat? And Jansen in my
So
chat,
in terms of
his kid,
that's
I don't know
what you
how old this
ultimately
kid is
kind
at
of
all.
see as
But
relevant evidence here
he
is
likes
that
to
Mr.
play
Floyd had an enlarged heart.
Fortnite
Yes.
on Twitch, and he doesn't have a lot of followers or viewers or anything.
How does the size
So,
of the heart?
I think Jansen would
affect,
like it if you guys just followed this
blood
dude,
supply,
Kaizen Ryzen.
nutrients, oxygen,
but-
things of that nature?
You know,
The heart is a muscle. And
I'm trying to
it's
do what I
dependent
can for that
on
little guy. I don't know how old he is.
supply of
Maybe he's
oxygen,
35.
glucose,
Never heard
and
his
other
voice yet
important nutrients
since I'm streaming.
to function.
Hey, Shiz, ever heard of a
When a
Christian
heart or
camp
any
called
other
Silver
muscle
Bird Ranch,
grows in
Wisconsin?
size,
Nope.
its consumption of
I've
those
heard of,
vital components
The name,
increases.
what the fuck is the name of that camp?
So Mr. Floyd's heart would have
There's a different camp. Camp
twice
Whitcomb.
the need of those nutrients compared to.
Did you miss my stream yesterday?
1860
Actually, I
grams.
forgot yesterday was my brother's birthday,
170 gram
and we were doing all this shit for my
would be
brother's
right in the
birthday.
middle
So
of the
instead,
Molina
I
study
recorded the first
criteria.
episode of the Shizcast,
Because there's just twice as much heart muscle.
and that is being
to support,
set as public right now. I'm
and
publishing
each of
it.
those cells is bigger and
Hold on, I have to put a.
requires more oxygen.
So it's kind of like the law of supply and demand, right?
I have to put a
Correct.
thumbnail on.
Right. What happens to a person when they experience
Hold on a second.
A lack of supply, so to speak?
So, like every other organ, the heart has certain reserves of energy built in.
I'm gonna make a thumbnail quick.
The typical amount of reserve in our brains is enough for us to maintain consciousness for about 10 to 15 seconds. And that is the organ which is most sensitive to constant supply.
The heart or the
No,
brain?
the brain. The heart is the next. But like other organs, it will be able to maintain function even when the supply is reduced or even completely cut off. But at some point, you do have to resupply, because those reserves are, when the heart is being exerted, are being used. And you either have to completely replace them, or if you only partially replace them, at some point you're going to exhaust the reserves.
So how do we replenish the supply, so to speak?
The replenishment comes through the coronary arteries, and they bring blood into the heart. As that blood arrives, it delivers oxygen and other nutrients, and it also removes the byproducts of the metabolism of those heart muscles as they contract.
So what type of symptoms might someone who show if they are diminished in their supply?
So at some point there are a variety of symptoms that can result. You can feel your heart racing, you may even get palpitations, you get potentially short of breath, and in some circumstances you may start getting chest pain, what we refer to as angina, and it can get even worse than that. You can have sudden symptoms such as a collapse without any warning, but there's a spectrum of different symptoms that can occur.
So when the supply isn't being met, what would a person customarily do to replenish the supply?
Well, when one becomes short of breath, you tend to relax, ease up, back off, stop walking, stop running, stop exercising until such time as you feel like you've got your heart rate down. Some people monitor their heart while they're exercising to ensure they don't go over certain limits. So there's different ways of doing it, but typically if you experience symptoms, it's your body telling you, slow down.
And what happens if someone doesn't do that?
If you don't, and you don't heed those warnings, or you can't heed those warnings for other circumstances, the consumption of those...
All right, there it goes. It's out there.
Check
that out.
Metabolites goes on. The production of the products of contraction, which need to be removed, continues to increase.
That's all I did yesterday.
And at some point, the heart will fail, have a sudden cardiac arrest / arrhythmia.
Glad I didn't miss it. It was you and not me. Yes, that's true.
In the field of forensic pathology,
I just went out to dinner and went to the casino here.
We typically call it sudden cardiac arrest or cardiac
I lost here.
What's the difference?
So you went to Silver Birch Ranch. It's pretty good.
Sudden cardiac arrest really
Sweet, man. I'm glad you had fun, man.
An observational situation.
You should call Dr. House to the stand. He would say it's not lupus, then pop a Vicodin.
And usually the background process is an arrhythmia of some sort.
They don't wear them when they're on the stand. Like the judge wears it when he's not talking.
Into a more malignant arrhythmia, which then decreases the function of the heart, and eventually the heart fails.
That's right. The judge wears it when he's not talking.
So
they all wear it when they're not talking.
Cause a heart to be bigger, like Mr. Floyd's.
The commonest one in the
How long is the child going to be?
United States, which is
like
part
at
of the
least,
developing world, is hypertension.
I don't think it's probably. I don't know. I think it's going to continue for a while.
And based on what you reviewed,
a couple more weeks. I don't know.
Determine whether Mr. Floyd had hypertension.
The size of the heart would be extremely good evidence that he had hypertension.
Well, they do have plexiglass, but whatever.
Secondly, there are medical records that I did see where he had an elevated blood pressure at previous hospital administrations or previous clinical interactions. So yes, there's evidence that he had that. And then there was something else found at autopsy, a tumor that is sometimes associated with hypertension as well.
Hypertension.
That's a paraganglioma?
Paraganglionoma, yes.
Anoma, sorry. We will talk about that a little bit later. So just kind of generally, can you describe the major blood vessels of the heart?
Yes. There really are two major blood vessels, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery, within a very short distance of coming off the aorta, divides into two major arteries, the left anterior descending and the left circumflex. So some people call it three coronary arteries, but technically there are two, with one dividing into two. Neither description would be incorrect.
And what is narrowing or stenosis of the arteries?
So narrowing or stenosis of the arteries means that the arteries, the lumen, the inside diameter of that artery is smaller than it should be. It has been narrowed by a disease process.
How does long-term drug use affect narrowing of the arteries?
There are certain drugs that do cause advanced or more rapidly advancing atherosclerosis. Not just drugs, but many substances and toxins, even smoking, for instance, is associated with earlier atherosclerosis. And certain drugs and other drugs, substances, can be added onto that particular list. So even urban pollution has a risk of advancing heart disease.
What specific drugs?
Well, in this particular case, methamphetamine, which was present in Mr. Floyd, has been associated with earlier onset of narrowing of the coronary arteries by atherosclerosis.
And can you describe the difference between proximal and distal narrowing of the arteries?
Right. So the narrowing can occur anywhere up and down the artery. When it occurs close to its origin, i.e. close to the aorta where the blood supply comes from, we will call that proximal. If it occurs far down the artery towards the end of the artery, or further down the artery, it's called distal. The implications are somewhat different. And if you have narrowing close to the beginning of the artery, anything downstream from that narrowing is subject to decreased supply of blood.
And this guy goes on for a generation.
If you have it further down in distal,
it's
then
almost
the
a break.
first part and all the branches that come off the first part are supplying that heart, and that part of the heart will
And then
still
he keeps
receive
going.
enough supply. It's not
Video up
restricted.
here.
But once you get to
Break
beyond
right
the
there,
narrowing,
break.
any
And then they
tissue,
come
heart
back
tissue,
right
muscle
here.
downstream
The
from
cross-examination of
that
this
is going
guy.
to be
Oh,
subjected to a reduced supply. And so in this particular case,
I know,
he
Plukser
had
is the best,
significant
man.
narrowing of all of his coronary arteries close to their origin,
Leave a
which really is
positive message, a comment for
consistent
Fluke.
with all of his
Make
heart,
sure you hit like on it.
unfortunately, being subjected to reduced supply. Not just a portion of his heart, but the entire heart.
Is there a certain amount of narrowing that forensic pathologists consider to be enough to cause sudden death?
So the typical conventional number that forensic pathologists use is between 70 and 75% narrowing is a risk factor for sudden cardiac death.
Can you survive with greater than 75% narrowing?
Oh, absolutely. I have seen many, many cases where it can be 90, 95%. Again, it depends where on the artery it is. So proximal narrowing is more dangerous than distal narrowing because only part of the heart. And
Sammy, coming in with the $1. Thank you so much.
So
Sammy,
he was
shout out Sammy, the big chat code with that big dick donation. Hey, thank you so much, man.
So when he was
Sammy
donated $1.
walking around,
Derek Chauvin is
doing
a
his
racist murderer, and it is hard to watch this white supremacist defend him.
normal daily activities.
Wow, that's crazy. But thank you so much for the $1.
Information that he was
I disagree with you.
or having any problems. So yes,
Fully disagree with
can go
you,
beyond 75%.
but I will take your money, so thanks.
That's why cardiologists may conclude you could survive with greater than 75%.
The fact that
Yeah,
you would
so
call someone
the difference is that
racist
medical examiners
and
see
call
people
someone a
who
white
died at
supremacist without
75%,
knowing barely shit about them
and cardiologists
makes
see
me
people
think
who are walking
you're
around
the one that's
100%.
racist.
So they see the live population, we
Unless
see the
that's
dead
a troll.
and so we
And I'm taking the bait.
different standards based on, unfortunately,
In which case,
that's what we see.
shout out to get that good bait.
So in terms of an autopsy finding, can you describe what myocyte necrosis is and whether that's necessary to diagnose a sudden cardiac death?
So myocyte necrosis is both something you can. You have to visualize it microscopically. You have to look at the individual heart cell. The myocyte is just a word which is heart cell. You can infer that there may be myocyte necrosis at autopsy if you see bleeding into the heart itself. But it is a microscopic diagnosis, and it is not necessary for myocyte necrosis to be present for a sudden cardiac death.
So someone who has a sudden cardiac death may not have myocyte necrosis.
Correct.
Why might that happen? Why might someone not have that myocyte necrosis?
Again, the heart goes through a process of dying. It takes a while for a heart to die and for the actual myocytes to start showing the changes that we can see under a microscope. And we need to understand that that's why you can do heart transplants. In somebody who has been injured or suffered some other catastrophe to their brain and is brain dead and is a donor, their heart can be removed.
Is a donut? Is that what he said?
Put on ice, flown across the country, and put into another person without any damage to that heart. And that process takes hours. So if the death is rapid, you will not see myocyte necrosis. It's the time frame from the heart stopping to the time we typically see myocyte necrosis is going to be somebody who has had symptoms and survived for a period of time, so that that process can advance to the degree where we can see it under the microscope.
Okay. Now, you've kind of talked about sudden cardiac events. Let's talk about the arrhythmia. Can you describe what is called the conduction system of the heart?
The conduction system of the heart is a very important part of the orderly contraction of our heart. We have two chambers which receive blood from the body, the atria, and then we have two bigger, very muscular chambers, the ventricles, that pump blood under high pressure.
Damn, I feel like I'm back in 8th grade.
And so the way the heart works is it's a
Jesus Christ.
two-chamber on
Is there going to be a
side.
quiz after
One side
this?
supplying the lungs and the other side supplying the body.
Should I be taking notes or not?
The atria contract.
Will this be on the
push blood
test?
into the ventricles to fill them up.
Or can I just take another 5-minute
The
nap?
ventricles contract to push blood to the body. The ventricles are very powerful, and there's a valve in between them to stop the blood flowing back. So what you need is an orderly contraction process where the atria contract first, followed by the ventricles. This is coordinated by the conduction system. And we have in the heart what is known as the cardiac pacemaker.
I think
Generic
when he
term.
decided to
But
eat
it's
the rest of the pills
little piece
that caused
of
him to
modified
overdose and
heart
die,
muscle that actually has almost
that's when he chose to
nerve-like
basically
function.
kill himself.
Does that have a name? Sorry.
It's called
He was too scared
sinoatrial
to
nerve.
go back to jail.
And that
He decided to
generates
break the law and
initial
have the illegal drugs.
activity,
Wasn't
which
didn't have enough balls to
causes
face the consequences
the
when he
atria
got
to
caught.
start contracting,
Decided to
and
eat
between
the
it
drugs to try not to get
and
caught,
another node, which
and
is at
he
the junction
knew
of
that
the
it was probably
atria
too
and
much,
ventricles,
that he couldn't
the
handle it,
atrioventricular
and
node.
he killed
There
himself,
is a little
and he died.
bundle of modified heart muscles that conduct that down, and then there are further modified heart muscles that go down to spread the impulse, the electrical
I don't think he
impulse to
killed
the
himself
heart
on
to cause it to
purpose,
contract.
but I
What are
think
those called?
he took he obviously took the
That's-
drugs on
yeah,
purpose,
it's the
and he
bundle of
probably knew he
histopathology,
wouldn't. It was too much.
Fibers, etc. They will have medical terminology, but basically it's modified heart muscle cells. So what that does is the
Yo.
atrial node fires, and the impulses can
Maybe don't try to fucking pass off a fake $20 bill and steal
At that
bananas at the
time,
grocery store.
The atria contract.
Yeah, he called his
forcing blood
girlfriend
into-
mama. That's
at the
not.
time
That's
that
totally
the
normal,
impulse
right?
arrives at the ventricles. That node then fires shortly after the atria, and the heart contracts and sends the blood on its way.
It's totally normal to call
So
your
you have
girlfriend
this
mama, isn't it?
orderly double beat
Mama.
to the heart.
Mama.
You can hear the valves
Mommy.
opening and closing. Atria
Mama.
first, and then the ventricles.
Mommy.
That's the sound that the physician listens to when he puts a stethoscope over your heart.
That's the
Jonathan G.
blood
It's
pressure.
It's
Sorry?
Floyd's
Is that
fault.
blood pressure?
They wouldn't have had to
So the
restrain
blood
him if he
pressure
would
is
have
actually
complied with
generated
police
by
orders.
the
He didn't understand
contraction
that
of the
police have the
ventricles.
right to put you in custody if they suspect you of a
That's
crime.
the essential output of the heart. Is
He fucking
directly
wriggled
related
out of
to
that
the
car
volume
like
and the
crazy.
pressure
He would not get in the
of
car.
Blood that is pushed out of the heart.
Okay. So what happens if this conduction system gets impaired?
Then you don't have orderly contraction of the heart.
You polish your nails before
And
you
so
pack
they
the
fire
bolt.
at
Now
the
we
wrong
wait.
Then
Damn it.
If you had the atria and ventricles firing at the same time, you would move no blood.
You blame the kid
Ventricles
behind
are
the
very
counter
powerful. They slam
George
that
Floyd's death?
valve shut. The atria fire at the same time. They can't force blood past it.
Wow.
And so you've got no flow.
And he didn't know
to
it was
fill the
fake
ventricle.
until after he took it.
Is that an arrhythmia?
But
That's
that
an
is
arrhythmia.
a
So there are multiple different
That
types of arrhythmias that
is a
that
crazy
involve.
take.
And what can happen?
That is a boneheaded take.
Well,
To
can sudden
blame
death
the
happen as a
fucking
result of an
cashier
arrhythmia?
kid. I mean, come
Absolutely.
on, dude.
So which artery supplies that pacemaker, the SA node that you described?
The sinoatrial node is supplied by a small branch that comes off the right coronary artery.
And did you review again the autopsy and observe findings relevant to Mr.
If that
Floyd's
kid
right
wanted to
coronary
make $100,000,
Yes, so unfortunately,
he would write a
that
book.
is the artery which
he'd
shows
get
the greatest
he'd
degree
get a
of
publishing deal, get some ghostwriter,
was how much?
dictate
90%.
in whatever
Does that
language he
increase, or
wants
that
what
type of
happened. The
narrow
dude
increase,
writes a book out of it.
the
Boom.
risk for sudden death?
Cha-ching.
Yes, in that if and when
What happened?
The-
My life behind the counter.
blood supply
The cup food story.
needs of the heart on the right side increase, and that's also going to apply to the sinoatrial node. Are not
What
met.
about the
That
guy
sinoatrial node will
who
not
made
function
the
properly,
fentanyl?
and the will not fire
Jonathan,
properly, and
You
will
blame
end up with
Hewlett
an
and
arrhythmia
Packard's
of some
printer
sort.
division?
So essentially, if it misfires, there's no pacemaker. Right? Or
We have a new
That-
plaintiff in
that-
this
That is
case.
correct, yes.
I'd like to call the stand
does
Hewlett
exertion
Packard.
come into
Hewlett
the
Packard,
analysis?
you're now being accused of murder. How do you plead?
Exertion basically
Says
increases the demand
Not guilty.
for oxygen throughout the entire body, mostly because of the muscular activity. So as we exercise, our heart rate and our breathing rate normally compensate
he was scared of
to
George.
increase the
So then,
oxygen
You're saying he was so menacing
that we're bringing
that
into
he
the body
scared the
through
shit
respiratory system
and intimidated the kid
increase
to accept
the
fake
amount of
money?
blood, or amount of oxygen
How is that the kid's
blood
fault?
which is being distributed to
Clearly George
the body.
Floyd's fault
And the way that
for being such a
increase
menacing,
of
high, fucked up
blood-
man
the way the
who's
body increases
looking like
the
he's
blood
1 second away
supply
from
is to increase the rate
you
of the
know,
heart. So we
whooping
will go
someone's
from our
ass for
resting
not taking
heart
the money.
rates, which is somewhere between 60 and 100. We'll push it up to
the guy who made a
120,
fentanyl is no
140,
more.
150,
All right,
depending on
all right,
the
Sam.
degree of exertion.
What about the guy who
And
pressed the
beyond,
fentanyl
it's
into the
dangerous.
legal pills?
So essentially, the
Not
more
the dude who made the
exertion,
fentanyl,
more
but the dude who used the
oxygenated
fentanyl
the
and mixed it with the meth
Yes.
and pressed it into the fake
How
oxys.
do drugs like methamphetamine come into play? As far
Kid
as
said he knew the bill is
uh,
fake, but
in
accepted
terms
it to
of
help
the
George out. Well, no, the kid took it and then he instantly
So
went to the manager's like,
methamphetamine
that guy just
is
used a fake bill.
dangerous at several levels.
And then he
in this
said, the manager
particular
said, go
case.
talk to him. Then he went out there and talked to him.
It has
And then he came back, the
no
manager's, and he's like, yo,
arrhythmogenic
he didn't
potential. In
give me
other
any
words,
real
it
money, but I'll just take it out of my own
sensitizes
paycheck. The manager's
to
like,
arrhythmias.
no. Don't take it out of your own paycheck. Go back out there and talk to him again. Then he went back out there and talked to him again. And then this time,
People on methamphetamine have
fucking
an
Maurice
increased
Hill
risk of
took out another fake 20,
arrhythmia.
ripped it up. He's probably like,
Secondly,
yeah, I paid with a
increases the
fake
rate that the heart
dollar
beats
bill,
as a
N-word.
stimulant.
What?
It pushes the
It's don't
heart
mean nothing to me.
beat rate.
Get out of my face, little N-word.
therefore the
Some
heart
shit like
is
that.
now
All
going to
this
demand
gangster shit.
increased
As I said, he ripped up another one.
itself.
You know, threw it at him.
And thirdly,
And then the
it
kid
is
went
a
back inside and was like,
vasoconstrictor.
all right, I'll just
What
take
is
it
a
out of my paycheck. I'll just take it out of my paycheck. And the
A
boss is like,
vasoconstrictor is a
I'm calling the
substance which
cops.
causes
Bring.
blood vessels
That's
in
what
the
happened.
arteries
Does anyone else watch a
to
trial here?
narrow.
God.
It's physiologically important, and it is protective in certain circumstances, but can become dangerous in others. And the way a vasoconstrictor works in most circumstances is to act on the muscular layer that's present in arteries. Our arteries have multiple different layers, and there's a muscular layer in there, and it causes that muscular layer to begin to contract. A little bit of contraction, that's good. Too much contraction, and it can slow down the blood beyond what is necessary, and even in certain circumstances, you can stop the blood by giving a vasoconstrictor substance.
Okay. So in this particular case, we've got an enlarged heart, right?
Yes.
We have a heart that has narrowed coronary arteries, right?
Yes.
And based on your review of the video evidence, you observed a pretty significant struggle between Mr. Floyd and the 3 officers?
Correct.
Methamphetamine on board, which is a vasoconstrictor?
Yes.
Have you or your colleagues ever certified a death due to the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease?
Yes, it's a unfortunately very common cause of death.
And even at these levels of narrowing, 75 and 90?
Anything above 75%, as I previously mentioned, meets the criteria for enough narrowing, at least within the community of practicing forensic pathologists.
Have you ever performed an autopsy sort of expecting one cause of death but finding another?
That's why we perform autopsies. It is a thorough internal examination to identify anatomic deviations from normal, and so therefore your preconceived notion, I wouldn't say a common example, but we see it every now and then, would be a motor vehicle collision, where somebody has multiple injuries, and you look at them and go, okay, they've got enough injury there to kill them. But when you go in, you can see evidence that they had a stroke or a heart attack. And that's what potentially caused them to lose control of their vehicle at the time that they had and got all their multiple injuries. And so then we sit with the issue of, do we put the heart attack under part 1?
Fucking dude's just taking bad notes. Dude, I want to read whatever the fuck Chauvin's writing down.
Conditions, because obviously they were driving their vehicle.
I just want to see one page of his notes.
Consciousness. So these are just dilemmas that we face as to where you put things on a death certificate. And sometimes you're not right and you're not wrong.
How about hypertensive cardiovascular disease? How does that relate to a cause of death?
So, again, there are a number of sudden cardiac deaths that are related solely and exclusively to the increased size of the heart. And so those are the ones that, since hypertensive disease is the most common cause of an enlarged heart, we would typically use that as the cause of death and say hypertensive cardiovascular disease.
Have you ever certified a death due to hypertensive cardiovascular
He's
disease?
taking the minutes for
Yes,
the trial.
multiple times.
Have you diagnosed both
That's
hypertension
funny.
and coronary artery disease?
I didn't get
as a
that.
cause
Can you
of
say that
death
one more
in
time?
combination?
Yes, and again, that is probably even more common because a significant proportion of the population have hypertension, so their hearts are enlarged, and as you get older, you tend to lay down deposits of material in your arteries, and so there's often both are present in many cases, unfortunately.
Now, again, in terms of hypertensive cardiovascular disease, we talked earlier about kind of the struggle between Mr. Floyd and the officers getting into the squad car. How does that type of exertion play into hypertensive cardiovascular disease?
It increases both with the hypertensive and the atherosclerotic. It increases the demand and the stress on the heart.
Demand
and
stress.
The more the
on the
individual
heart.
is stressed, both physically and in other ways, the more the demand on the heart is going to increase.
So in terms of stress, right, how does that affect the heart?
So we have certain innate stress mechanisms built into us, reflexes built into us. It's called the fight and flight reflex, is the common terminology that you will see within the medical literature and also within the lay literature. And this is a mechanism where if you are in a stressful situation, it prepares your body to be able to cope with the stressful situation. And what happens generally is the sympathetic part of your nervous system begins to act. That causes secretion of adrenaline as one of the examples.
Oh, that sounds hot.
And
Secretion
other
of
catecholamines,
adrenal,
which are substances that are part of that sympathetic nervous system. And adrenaline causes some of your blood vessels to constrict. It's another potent vasoconstrictor. The idea being that you don't need to digest the food in your stomach, for instance, while you're in a very, very dangerous environment. So it really shunts the blood, pushes the blood to the organs that are more important: the heart, the lungs, the brain, your muscles. It also shuts down the blood supply to your skin. So it does all of those things. But it also speeds up the heart to increase the cardiac output to maintain oxygenation of the brain, your muscles, and other things, so that you can have an additional reserve to fight that threat.
All right. Now, so the fight or flight kind of that you described, it increases adrenaline, right? It causes the heart to beat faster. Agreed?
Yes, and yes.
I'm hungry.
And the adrenaline, how does that come into play? Did you say that was a vasoconstrictor?
I'll just talk about cup foods that make me hungry.
Adrenaline is a vasoconstrictor, yes.
Including the arteries?
Oh, yes.
And ultimately, what does that do, potentially?
So it narrows the arteries. And again, we have smooth muscle in the cardiac arteries. So there's a potential of the adrenaline and the methamphetamine further narrowing those
when this break comes up,
arteries.
I'm gonna go get some food,
as well as arteries.
But I'm gonna let it play in case by the time I get back.
Now, in terms of that kind of stress reaction,
so that's what we're gonna do.
This
you just finished your McDonald's lunch. I'm going to get some lunch during this lunch break, but I'm gonna keep the stream on. I'm not cutting stream, just so everyone knows.
2019.
I'm just going to get some food, then I'm going to come back here, eat the food while I stream right here. I'm going to eat the food right in front of the camera.
To ingesting some controlled substances at that point, and was subsequently seen by paramedics. Do you recall that information in the information you reviewed generally?
I did.
And at the time that he was initially seen by paramedics, his blood pressure was taken, and if I'm not mistaken, it was 216/160. What does that signify to you as far as this stress relation?
You're making a steak,
high
hell
blood
yeah.
pressure like that, and that's markedly elevated. Could be due to.
I'm getting some barbecue. I'm getting Mission Barbecue.
But this is much higher than I would.
Owned by vets.
Secondly, it could be part of the stress reaction where adrenaline is being secreted.
Or maybe it's owned by
pushing his heart rate up,
former police,
and that
one
will
of
increase
those.
your blood pressure. And if adrenaline is secreted, it's also causing vasoconstriction. So there's more blood staying within the central vasculature, and so therefore that will also increase your blood pressure. There are multiple explanations for that, but certainly stress would be one.
That does sound bomb.
Your Honor, I believe that right now would be a good time.
The closest Chipotle, though, is in the next city over.
Minutes, reconvene
Honestly,
at
fuck that.
11:10.
Alright, chat. I'm going to get some food. I'll talk to you in a little bit. I'm cutting my cam. I'm going to leave the mic on. Mic off. What I mean is I'm leaving the stream on. If you guys want to go take a break, this is their little lunch break situation. It's only going to be like 15 minutes or so. Actually, less than that. So if you guys want to go take a break, do that. I will be back soon with some food. Shizbang out.
In terms of the other contributing factors to Mr. Floyd's death, did you, as a part of your review, make other considerations to things that may have contributed?
Yes, I did.
I'd like to discuss with you carbon monoxide, or CO. Okay. You've reviewed all of the videos in the case, correct?
I did.
Did you pay attention to where Mr. Floyd's head was positioned relevant to the squad car?
Yes, I did.
Which way was his face, nose, mouth facing?
His face was facing towards the vehicle, towards the rear of the vehicle, and directly towards the area where you would expect the tailpipe or tailpipes of a vehicle to be.
And let me just ask you, are you suggesting that Mr. Floyd died from carbon monoxide poisoning?
Absolutely not, no. Not a full carbon monoxide poisoning, no.
All right. Now, I'd like to, if the court could publish, and before the court does, the next slide has a screenshot from Officer King's body-worn camera at 20:24:09. Do you see that in front of you there?
I do not at this time, no.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, I have independently marked this single slide as Exhibit 1058, and based upon discussions with counsel, I'd move for its admission.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
1058 is received.
Permission to publish? Dr. Fowler, based on your review of the videos and evidence, were you able to determine if the vehicle was running?
There was evidence that the vehicle was running.
What would that evidence consist of?
What I observed was a collection of fluid. I don't know if this is working. Maybe I'm doing it the wrong way. Collection of fluid.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Objections overruled.
Dr. Fowler, based on your general knowledge as a forensic pathologist, your personal experiences, what comes out of a car's exhaust?
Typically, we see the products of combustion. It's an internal combustion engine. coming out the exhaust. And the major products of combustion are going to be water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and then a couple of other very small other particulate and minor gases that come out of the exhaust pipe.
Is carbon monoxide toxic?
It is an extremely toxic gas.
How does it act as a poison?
Carbon monoxide attaches to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, and it attaches to those red blood cells more tightly than oxygen. So it competes for the same binding position on the hemoglobin that oxygen does. And since it is a better, and it binds more firmly, the oxygen can't displace it. So as the percentage of carbon monoxide bound to your hemoglobin in your bloodstream slowly goes up, you lose that portion of your oxygen carrying capacity. So if you have a 10% carbon monoxide saturation in your bloodstream, you've lost 10% of your oxygen carrying capacity.
Okay. Can that cause ultimately death?
When you get to levels way in excess of 50-60%, people typically, even young healthy individuals, will start to die. The issue is that people with significant heart disease and reduced capacity in their heart are going to be adversely affected earlier. And so there are certainly many examples in the literature of people dying in an environment where multiple people are exposed, but one person dies at, and I've seen this, less than 20%, and the others die at varying levels above that. So it's not universal that everybody will require to get to 60, 70, 80%. That's a young, healthy individual. But people with predisposing conditions who are vulnerable will die at much lower levels.
So in terms of the literature, are you familiar generally with the literature on carbon monoxide poisoning?
Yes.
Specifically, are you familiar with the paper by DeMaio and Dana on carbon monoxide poisoning in open spaces?
Yes, that is a paper that came out in the late 80s, I believe.
And is this here as a part of your PowerPoint, that article, or the title of that article?
Yeah, this is the title sheet or title portion of that particular paper that was published by the two doctors, yes.
And that was in the late 80s, you said?
Correct.
Are you familiar with CDC warnings on carbon monoxide in open spaces?
Yes.
Can you describe what this slide represents?
So this is the outdoor air recommendations. So we're talking about indoor air, outdoor air recommendations by the EPA, and recommending that individuals are not exposed to more than 9 parts per million for 8 hours. Anything above an 8-hour exposure puts you at risk of absorbing carbon monoxide, which can put you at risk of at least symptoms, if not more. And when you go up to 35 parts per million, so not much of an increase, that exposure limit drops to 1 hour.
So in terms of the CDC versus the EPA, what does the CDC say?
Well, they're both saying, just be careful of carbon monoxide regardless of your environment.
Are you familiar with the Consumer Product Safety Commission scale? So, excuse me, the Consumer Product Safety Commission?
Yes.
Is that the information that you obtained for this case?
So this is the top of the page that they refer to, and if you go to the next slide, it actually says what it says on the page. And basically they're saying that most people will not experience any symptoms from a prolonged exposure to carbon monoxide between 1 and 70 parts per million. But some heart patients may experience an increase in chest pain. In other words, become symptomatic in that range. As CO levels increase and remain above 70 parts per million, symptoms become more noticeable and include headache, fatigue, and nausea. And once you get above 150 to 200 parts per million, people become disoriented, unconscious, and death.
Did you guys miss me?
So the higher the level, the more rapid and the more
Hello?
serious
Hello,
the
hello.
potential consequences of exposure to a source of carbon monoxide is.
Are you also familiar
Hello?
with the World Health Organization standards?
Yes.
Is that the next slide?
So this is just again the header from their document. The relevant information is on the next slide. And they go a little further than the EPA, giving us more data. And what they do is they've got the same 9 parts per million for 8 hours. Their recommendation is not more than 26 parts per million for 8 hours, not the 35 that the CDC, the EPA has. At 52 parts per million, the risk of exposure issues occurs in 30 minutes at 52 parts per million, which is in that 1 to 70 range that the EPA said is okay. And then at 87 parts per million, 15 minutes is all it takes to start getting yourself into having absorbed a decent amount of carbon monoxide.
Now, you're not a mechanic, correct?
No.
All right. But are you aware of
Show
some
food.
sort of general
All right.
standards in terms of the emission of carbon monoxide by vehicles?
Yes, I am. It's
Big
part
bag,
of
but it's only one little
the
container.
general knowledge that forensic pathologists have as to the different types of sources of carbon monoxide.
And would that include the California Air Resources Board?
Yes, this is one of the most strict automobile emission regulations.
And what does the regulations stand for?
So in California, and it's been adopted in about 14, 15 states around the country. So California has been copied by various other states. Some states have not copied it. I could not find any
This
reference
is
to
beans. I'll
Minnesota
show it
being,
when I open it up.
a carb state.
Brisket and pulled pork,
So-
man.
But adopting the California stringent
And then I have some
regulations, a vehicle may emit
hot
up
sauce.
to 1,200 parts per million of carbon monoxide
Well,
from
it's like
exhaust.
not hot sauce. It's barbecue sauce,
Going back
but
to
it's
the
like
prior
spicy
slide, where would
barbecue.
that fall within
Tupelo
the
and
World
Baja
Health
Bowl.
Organization- World Health Organization guidelines?
Well, they go up to 87. We're talking 1,200, so we're talking in excess of 10 times. 12,
Now-
13 times.
Now, again, you're not suggesting to the jury that Mr. Floyd died of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Not exclusively, no.
How would you be able to determine
Ooh, look at
the
that.
role that carbon monoxide played in a particular death?
Typically, and the easiest way for a medical examiner to do that is to have the blood tested by a laboratory for what we call carboxyhemoglobin saturation. And it will come back from the laboratory giving us a percentage saturation.
To your knowledge, was Mr. Floyd's blood tested for carbon monoxide?
I could not find a reference to it.
That's the brisket.
Now, the previous articles that we kind of looked at, the DeMaio, I think you said, from the late 80s, are there more recent studies on the effect of carbon monoxide
Real good.
exposure in open spaces?
Yes.
Is that this? Oops.
Yeah.
Everybody loves barbecue.
Mixed in here.
I don't think I put this into the PowerPoint,
Oh, okay.
Mr. Nelson.
All right.
Yes, there's a recent study or case report
That's
that
so good.
came out of Poland, where a taxi driver committed suicide by taking his vehicle, parking it in an open space, taking one of the mats out of the vehicle, putting it behind the vehicle, and then lay down on the mat and inhaled the exhaust. And he ended up with a very high level of carbon monoxide. It was in the 80s. Certainly sufficient to be an exclusive cause of death in that particular case. The interesting thing about that particular study was it provided no new information as carbon dioxide is dangerous. Carbon dioxide comes out of exhausts, and you can do this because it replicated what DeMaio and Dana had done 20 or 30 years before. But what was done in that particular case was that the authorities tested the amount of carbon monoxide.
They tasted
coming
the blood,
out
or
of
they
exhaust.
tested the blood.
So they did a recreation, reenactment, and took carbon monoxide sensors and put them at approximately the place where the man's nose and mouth were, and then monitored the carbon monoxide.
That's how you
coming out
save
of his
room in your
vehicle.
recycling bin.
So the principle that you can test a vehicle and make a determination exactly how dangerous it is was properly tested in that particular case, and they found that when the breeze was blowing or the wind was blowing at or about this man's face, and he was about a foot away,
Ooh.
to give you a reference,
Yeah.
when the wind was blowing, the amount of carbon monoxide picked up by the sensor was 200 parts per million. And when the wind dropped, it went up to 790 parts per million, which is, again, almost 10 times the World Health Organization's recommendation. So in the area close to an exhaust, you're going to have a much higher level of carbon monoxide than you would if you're 3-4 feet away.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge, were similar experiments done in this case, or recreations?
I did not see any information that indicated that a similar recreation or was done in this particular case now.
In terms of modern vehicles, they have catalytic converters, correct?
Absolutely.
And what does a catalytic converter do relevant to carbon monoxide?
It reduces it dramatically. So in the era before catalytic converters, the amount of carbon monoxide coming out of a typical car exhaust would exceed 30,000 parts per million, and could be as high as 70,000 parts per million. So the catalytic converter and the modern emissions controls that you see on, at least in the California requirements, which are again the most strict, have reduced it by about 30 times to somewhere close to 1,000 to 1,200.
Now, in terms of, can you describe for the jury what a pulse oximeter is?
Yes, a pulse oximeter is a device that you put on the finger. It's a little clamp that you put on the finger, and it reads two things: your pulse rate and the oxygen saturation in your blood. So it counts the pulses, and it reads how much oxygen you're carrying in your blood by looking at the color of your fingernail.
How does carbon monoxide come into play in terms of pulse oximeter?
So the important thing is it appears to be oxygen. It changes the blood to a color which the pulse oximeter thinks is oxygen. So if you take somebody who has 50% saturation with carbon monoxide, it will still read that the person is 95% oxygen. It doesn't tell you that there's 50%. So if a pulse oximeter was put on Mr. Floyd's finger in the vehicle and again in the hospital, the pulse oximeter does not give us any information allowing us to say he was or was not under the influence of some degree of carbon monoxide intoxication.
How long does carbon monoxide typically stay in the bloodstream?
So it stays in the bloodstream. If you want to treat a person and put them on 100% oxygen, the half-life is about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. If you're exposed to ambient air, it takes much longer to get rid of the carbon monoxide.
And so, I mean, essentially removing that carbon monoxide from the bloodstream is a reversible process.
It's not an irreversible blonde, it is reversible. So yes, it will at some point slowly dissociate and be blown off. We do generate a small degree of carbon monoxide as part of our normal metabolism. It's a very low, sub 1%, and it binds to the oxygen, to the hemoglobin, and eventually dissociates and is eliminated. So in small amounts are not an issue, and yes, it will dissociate and be blown off at some point as part of the normal metabolism.
So how much carbon monoxide is needed to be absorbed into the bloodstream to diminish the oxygen supply?
Well, for a young, healthy individual, you want to probably exceed the 60, 70, 80% range. That's what we typically see. However, in individuals who have risk factors, that can be far, far less.
What type of risk factors would you look for?
So these are particularly, the individuals that are particularly at risk are people with cardiovascular disease, as we saw in Mr. Floyd, and people with chronic obstructive lung disease would also have a higher risk, and then other comorbidities, kidney disease, etc. But the real high-risk one is going to be heart.
And what percentage would you expect when someone presents with those conditions?
Very difficult to predict because everybody is different. There are studies out there where as little as 6% saturation with carbon monoxide in an individual who's exercising with heart disease will start causing arrhythmias. So it's a very low percentage. Now you have to have all of this, the heart disease and exercise, but at about 6%. There have been studies done in a controlled laboratory environment where people started showing EKG changes and premature ventricular contractions at about 6%. So it has potential to affect individuals at much lower levels than you would require for a young, healthy individual.
Now, in terms of findings at autopsy,
Sorry, I had to go feed my
certain
cat.
things at autopsy that
Cat
can
wanted some
determine
food.
The presence of carbon
All right.
monoxide or certain observations.
Cheers it up, guys. Ready?
The pathologist
1, 2,
will
3.
make.
Cheers it up.
Yes, typically carbon monoxide makes the blood appear, and the terminology, it looks like it's cherry red in color. It's not the standard pink or
Hell
slightly
yeah.
darker
Woo.
red color that we would see for deoxygenated blood. It's a fairly bright cherry red color. Hence the reason the pulse oximeters get somewhat confused as well. Now, when you get levels of 50, 60, 70%, and the greater majority of the blood is carboxyhemoglobin, it stands out. But when you're looking at levels that are 10%, 20%, it doesn't, and is not easy to see. A typical smoker, 1 pack a day, will have and can have a carboxyhemoglobin of 6%. 2 packs a day, you can get up to 12%. We just don't see that as forensic pathologists because there is so much background color from the normal blood that it's lost in that. So I would expect a pathologist, when there is substantial amount, to spot it relatively easily, but I would not expect somebody to see the lower levels that can still be a factor.
And to do that, you would need to test the blood?
That would be
Yummy.
the gold standard, yes. Test the blood and see how much carboxyhemoglobin is in the blood.
So if you're not saying that carbon monoxide caused Mr. Floyd's death, can you likewise eliminate it as a contributing factor?
The only way to eliminate carbon monoxide as
Use
a
Texas
contributing
rub
factor
and
would be
lean
to
parents on your
ensure
steak.
that there was none
Cook it in
in his
olive oil
blood
and
or
baste it
a
in
very,
butter.
very low level in his blood.
Then pour the butter on the mashed potatoes.
Um,
Hey, that sounds great.
So
I'll eat that.
in Mr. Floyd, it robs him of an additional percentage of oxygen carrying capacity. Whether that be 5%, 10%, 15%, it takes away
Oh, I would eat the shit out of
from
that, bro.
the important factor of getting blood to his heart muscle.
Honey Dijon on your sandwiches.
So this is just another
Sounds good.
potential
Probably
insult,
steak
another
burrito
brick
with
in the
everything
wall,
on it, with a large
unfortunately,
queso
for,
and large chips.
circumstances here.
Woo!
Now, ultimately, the officers weren't affected by this.
No, they were not.
And why could that be?
Well, they're another 2 to 3 feet away, and potentially, hopefully, they're much younger, and hopefully don't have heart disease. So, with every foot or more
Good thing I got
away,
food, otherwise you guys would be making me
the
hungry right
amount
now.
of carbon
Shit.
monoxide in that particular bubble is going to decrease.
Now, so we've discussed the heart, we've discussed carbon monoxide. Did you eliminate certain causes of death as well?
Yes,
Specifically referring to asphyxia.
correct.
How would you describe the investigation of custodial deaths compared to other types of deaths?
Very long, very complex, and something that needs to be done very, very carefully.
Are there many variables to consider?
Absolutely, there are huge number of variables, as we obviously can see in the case of Mr. Floyd as well.
Now, in terms of this article here in your PowerPoint presentation, what's the significance of this?
So this is an article that was put out, I think about 1992, by Dr. James Luke and Dr. Donald Ray. Dr. Donald Ray was one of the first pathologists to theorize that putting somebody in a face-down position was dangerous. And this was based on observations of cases where people were placed in a prone position and they died. And so his conclusion was that may well be a factor and needed to be considered. But what Dr. Ray also does say, and later on he recanted that to a large extent, but what he does say is that these are very difficult, complex cases. Don't rush to judgment. Make sure you've considered all of the potential issues that are at play in these particular cases. And they even talk about a crystal ball in this particular case, and the risk of underestimating the importance of common sense, and the fact that there are no easy answers in such deaths.
In your experiences as a forensic pathologist, have you had the opportunity to perform a death investigation and autopsies of in-custody deaths?
Yes.
So in this particular case, we've heard a lot about hypoxia. Which organ is more sensitive to hypoxia?
The brain is the most sensitive, or rapidly sensitive, to hypoxia.
In your review of the materials, did you have an opportunity to review some testimony of Dr. Baker in prior proceedings?
Yes.
Dr. Baker, in his testimony, referenced some studies in terms of the effects of positional asphyxia. Are you familiar with those studies?
Yes.
Did you take those studies into consideration as far as your analysis of this case?
Yes, that is the current state of the science or the knowledge base with regard to this very difficult situation.
So let's talk just simply about the prone position. Do people sometimes sleep in the prone position?
Yes, approximately 7% of the adult population sleep face down.
In terms of medical examinations, treatments, are people kept in the prone position?
In certain situations, people are examined in the prone position. There are therapeutic maneuvers where people are deliberately placed in the prone position. One of the best examples right now is COVID.
Thank you.
Should we break at this?
Prone position with and without weight. For was right situation.
People sometimes sleep in the prone position. In terms of the effects of positional asphyxia, are you familiar with those studies?
Yes.
Did you take those studies into consideration?
I got a different stream,
as far as your analysis,
so maybe the audio won't get auto-copyrighted this time.
That is the current
hopefully
state of the science or the knowledge base with regard to this very difficult
YouTube is acting weird, chat.
So let's talk just simply about the prone position. Do people sometimes sleep in the prone position?
Yes, approximately 7% of the adult population sleep face down.
In terms of medical examinations, treatments, are people kept in the prone position?
In certain situations, people are examined in the prone position.
Wait, am I
there
not
are
live or
therapeutic
what?
maneuvers where people are deliberately placed in the prone position. One of the best examples right now is COVID, where patients are going to be sat in a prone position, which is face down, and it improves their ability for oxygen